Thank you very much to Junta de Andalusia and to Guillermo and Juan for inviting me to say some things at this workshop. Can you hear me clearly? Or okay, I'll just speak quietly then. I'm Torsten Berg from Aarhus University in Denmark, and I'm also leading together with my colleague Gerald from Transtion Institute in Germany, a work package in the Agroecology partnership, which Juan also obviously did some introduction to here. So today I understood that after this workshop, after this presentation, there'll be some examples of living labs. So I thought it might be an idea to do something slightly more conceptual on living labs and try to explain why we are talking about living labs, and perhaps a little bit also about what are we talking about when we talk about living labs in this partnership. The objective here is really to draw attention to some of the emerging issues that are also coming up when we talk about living labs as mechanisms for agroecology transition or transformation, if you like. Hopefully, we will sort of, the question that I'd really like to ask is when and how are living labs transformative? Because this may not always be the case, perhaps. So I'd like to introduce you to the partnership agroecology and the conceptual framework, what informs us conceptually, theoretically, the underpinning rationale behind talking about living labs, and also living labs as transformation mechanisms, and then perhaps living labs as innovation models, whether narrow or broad. Living labs have been presented as a kind of, perhaps as a kind of miracle cure for a lot of things, and I think our job and I'm from the social sciences, so even if I'm involved in the partnership, I think our job is to also try to critically advance on that notion. So let's begin with the beginning, really, where take a step back and try to sort of find out why we suddenly started talking about living labs in around 2019. The idea is inspired by Canada, where they have worked with agroecosystem living labs for a number of years, and that idea of agroecosystem living labs was presented at a G20 meeting of agricultural chief scientists in 2018, and that inspired apparently the European Commission so much that they thought that okay, we're going to have something like that as well. So the definition that was used is used by the Canadians is that we're talking here about transdisciplinary approaches that involve farmers, scientists, and other interested partners, which typically would be research, in the co-design, the monitoring, and the evaluation of new and existing agricultural practices and technologies on working landscapes to improve their effectiveness and early adoption. So this was really what started it all off. And even though you can say there would be a difference between agroecosystem living labs and agroecology living labs, this actually became agroecology living labs in the partnership agroecology, and it's also a definition that you are likely to find in other partnerships and missions where there's a focus on living labs, like the Future Foods Partnership or the Soil Partnership, which I always forget what is the abbreviation now. But you can see over there the framework is really about accelerating adoption of technologies through transdisciplinary approaches and M&E and co-design and co-development. Quite a simple kind of conceptual framework. But before sort of going deeper into this, just the agroecology partnership, we do two types of research. There's internal research and there's external research. And as Juan talked about, there are actually 7 calls in the partnership, in the first phase of the partnership. The second one, and that's the external partnership. And I'm sure that Andalusian partners have also applied for this kind of. Then there's the internal, which is really where I work as a university. There's a lot of partners. It's a massive program. You can't really call it a project. It would be a program, and the funds are enormous. It's not very well reimbursed. My director, my head of department, he calls it because it's only 50% reimbursed. He says it's funding from hell. I'm not quite sure. I think it's good enough, but it's not the most attractive you can have. But then again, there are other benefits of being parts of it. Lots of partners and lots of countries with some underrepresentation in the eastern part of Europe and also in the Balkans, as you can see from the map. When the idea here is to, if we tune a little bit more into the living labs, then the idea is that the idea is to team up and unlock the transition to agroecology, to create resilient, productive, and prosperous, place-sensitive, as well as climate, environment, ecosystem, biodiversity, and people-friendly farming systems. This is the vision, really. And then if we dig deeper into what is really the policy proposition here, then it's the idea that agroecology transition by means of living labs and decentralized research infrastructures, and also with a strengthened role of agricultural knowledge and innovation systems, what we call AKIS, would be some of the keys to cause this transition. And then, as the arrows indicate, living labs play a central role in this, or the idea is that the real life testing of mainly technologies so far, but also, of course, farming systems will play a key role. And co-creation and multi-actor involvement is really sort of the core approaches here. And we have in the partnership, we have two internal research work packages that deal with living labs and research infrastructures. And the idea is that the research infrastructures, which often act as silos in universities or in research stations, should become more sort of active for farmers and for change, really come out of the closet a bit more. So we have one, the one I work with, the work package is expanding capacities of living labs and research infrastructures. And work package 8 is the coordination of a European network of agroecology, living labs and research infrastructures. You can see below, I'm not going to go into what the aims are, but agricultural knowledge and innovation systems are actually quite crucial here. And if we move on to the conceptual framework, then I think some of you would have seen this kind of framework before. It's what informs these days. It's the most dominant in my experience. It's the most dominant framework for people who work on agroecology. And you have on the left side, you have the 5 levels of agroecology transition, which is also known as the Gleesman scale, because Stephen Gleesman was the one who sort of conveyed this. So arguably you have levels 1 to 2, perhaps 3, which would be more along the lines of what we would call sort of sustainable intensification, rather technology-focused approaches, not so much redesign. The transformative aspects would sort of happen at the higher levels of agroecology, levels 4 and 5. And then the idea is that you have, and on the right-hand side, you have what is known as the 13 principles of agroecology, and which somehow are seen as enablers of agroecology. There's not that much about how they would be put into place or to what extent there might be some barriers also. But the idea is that if you mix it all up, then there'll be sort of a positive a positive approach towards some sort of transformation. How it's done is really not so, probably not so simple, but it is not so simple because there are lots of structural barriers in lock-ins and so on. Otherwise, arguably, you would have had some sort of transition already, perhaps. But the key here is that when we talk about living labs or decentralized knowledge production, it is to consider the co-creation, the innovation in living labs as the engine room of this framework. And from a research perspective, this focus on co-creation of knowledge and innovation in living labs connotes a shift in knowledge production away from the centralized models that we have that have not really delivered. They didn't deliver in this. Probably didn't deliver on the social and economic issues in the 60s and the 70s, and they don't seem to deliver very much on sustainability today either. So the focus is to restructure centralized research models into models whereby farmers' roles as research actors are strengthened. And now I'm sort of going a bit maybe over theoretical here, but I quite like this sort of thinking of these sort of paradigm shifts and the emphasis in research over time a little bit. And my point here is that this shift in knowledge production is actually rooted in a participatory rural research trajectory, which arguably goes back to Paulo Freire. And if you look at the matrix here, and this is also the point here is that there's none of this. This is all still here, right? So when I say since 1960s that you had these strong paradigms of linear transfer of technology, where farmers would learn, adopt, and conform, and which was very much focused or placed in a productivist paradigm. Then in reaction to that, you saw throughout the 80s and the 2000s, you saw a focus on something that became more and more participatory, and farming systems research, Farmer First, Robert Chambers, and so on, participatory research, which became sort of more and more moving and then of course at the same time more complex because you would have social ecological analysis, you would have livelihoods coming into the picture, you had a focus on agricultural knowledge and innovation systems in a holistic way, and we ended up now since 2018 with what I would call the new participatory kid on the block, which would be innovation in agroecology or in agroecology living labs. And again, we're seeing farmers and farmers' communities as sources of innovation. This was also something that was the case in 1980s, actually. But now we're doing it in a new way in living labs. And this then leads to some sort of integrated, which is also an integrated agroecology participation transformative framework. Which we have to, I think we have to somehow emphasize. It would be quite important here. So these are not neat categories. These are just trends, and I know this is sort of very loose stuff. But please don't arrest me for trying to categorize things a bit. The rationale from the if I should try and interpret the rationale on behalf of from the sort of the green. What do you call it? From the EU perspective, then the idea is that to meet these green transition goals by 2030 or even before that, that is seen by the European Commission and the partner countries to depend on. This is the rationale on new knowledge, new technologies, and new farming systems that are more relevant to and used by farmers than before. And by making them relevant. By working in living labs, they would also be adoption. They would be taken up by farmers and used at an increasingly swift pace. I think this is really the underpinning rationale here. So agroecology living labs supported by strengthened ACIS would actually be key drivers here. And the idea is that you bring people together to find solutions, as it's called, in user-driven, co-created technology experimentation outfits. So the focus is quite a lot in this rationale on the technology experimentation here. And digging a little bit deeper again, the underpinning ideas is probably something we can go back and find in what Altieri wrote, quite a long time ago actually now, that we in agroecological practices cannot be done in the context of standardized agricultural solutions, those that are associated with green revolution or industrialized agriculture. They have to be more place-specific and more context-specific in general, also socially and economically and culturally. And this, again, place specificity would connote a knowledge intensiveness, maybe some reskilling of farming and of farmers, and of course knowledge co-creation and sharing, and also transdisciplinarity, where you also work with farmers. And this would be done by, as I also talked about, by technology experimentation in working landscapes and fields, and networks of farm living levels. So I'd like to just dwell a little bit with this idea that it's technology experimentation that is at the core of this, and that would probably look a little bit like this, or this, at least this is some of the models that are being promoted, where on the right-hand side you see this sort of iterative cycles of co-developing, testing, and evaluating, and then you would have sort of an arrow that leads somewhere, perhaps towards some sort of redesign, but maybe not so much transformation, but some sort of redesign where you would have different actors involved with this. And the focus here is really on co-developing an evaluation of new and existing practices and technologies. So this is very much sort of like a technological techno-fix approach to things, I suppose. And if we look at sort of the agroecology, what agroecology is usually perceived as, which would be discipline, movement, and practice, here we're basically onto the discipline and the practice part, and not so much on other things. And this sort of brings us into the fact that living labs are actually many things to many people. Thank God it's not all things to all people, but it's many things to many people. And there are very many different understandings of living labs. And since living labs suddenly became the attention of the European Union, or the Commission, and there was funding behind it, a lot of people tried to get their heads around what are living labs then. And we have one quite important contribution by Mambrini and Dudet in 2021, where they defined the characteristics of living labs. And others came up with the Living Lab Innovation Cycle, which is again this rather technologically fixed one. And then, as I said before, the one I mentioned before, you do the planning and then you have some adoption at the end of the road. But I think it's probably more interesting to look at these definitions. I listed 5 definitions here, where we go from sort of a rather technical approach, where you have open innovation ecosystems within real-life environments, and you also have these iterative co-creation processes, and then you have living labs as a research methodology. And then somebody, Alami and Corno, actually point out that living labs may also be institutions that encourage learning and empowerment beyond the scope of a particular research project. So perhaps some sort of social learning kind of approach to this. And then somebody here, Morn and Anderson, suggests that living labs would go beyond the technological innovation and focus on social innovation and democratic participation in food system governance. So I don't know if you go back to the Gleesman scale, you see we're moving higher and higher up the transformation scale in these kind of definitions. So they move from the technological to the sort of broader innovation models, which focus on social innovation and democratic participation. I should just add that one of the reasons why we probably have this, the Commission or in the partnership, there is still this sort of idea about the technological focus would probably have to do with the fact that living labs are actually or were before they came into the rural realm. They were or into rural development. They were often they were used for technological innovation in campus environments and like the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and so on. But moving into the rural realm, of course, is a completely different kettle of fish. So, and this leads us to sort of, if we try to sort of recall this conceptual framework of transition and transformation and the food system, we can somehow place these definitions and their scope in this transformation perspective. And if we begin by the beginning, we have these the living labs that are what was the idea is that you have these technological living labs at levels 1 and 2, and you can of course argue, or you can ask, are these really agroecology living labs? How transformative is it if it works at these levels? And then if you go a little bit higher up, you can consider living labs with a broader innovation model that may perhaps work at the levels of redesign. And then you might have living labs that are more like the lower definition that go beyond the technical and move towards social innovations and democratic participation in food system governance. And these living labs are perhaps the ones that are then the broader ones, the ones that actually work also beyond the plot level and the farm level. They might actually be the ones that we could consider agroecology living labs. So, and the good news here is that now I've been criticizing the partnership approach. And the good news is actually that increasingly we see that in the partnership, we see that the agroecology as movements also is increasingly playing a role. The living labs that are applying to become part of the partnership, and which are also applying for the calls, are actually increasingly living labs that have a much broader perspective on things. Some of them are technology innovators, and you could also argue that there should certainly be a place for technology innovation. Farmers are really interested in that. But they also, very often, there are movements that attract, or they have brought environmental and rural development and food system innovation concerns, which is also my impression that this is the case in Andalusia, where you have a wide range of civil society-based local alternatives, farmers associations, cooperatives, private-public partnerships that actually try to promote broad-based redesign-oriented agroecology that focus not only on farming, but perhaps also on the entire value chain and the food system. So what we are seeing is that the partnership is actually moving, in my interpretation, to a much broader innovation model, which covers not only the science and the practice part, but also the movement part. This is actually also what Rødel would, when he sort of sees how has agroecology moved over the years. He points out that this agroecology used to be something that happened, if you look at the figure to the bottom right, was something that happened very much at the plot level, but then moved sort of into the farm and the ecosystem level, and also very much now at the food system level. And this is also something that reflects much of the rural innovation literature, where Iabano and Clerks point out that innovation for sustainability requires active mobilization of diverse innovation intermediaries that have multiple perspectives, and actually calls for organizations that act as a bridge to facilitate linkage creation between different actors in agroecology innovation. So you need a lot more. What they're proposing is that you do need a lot more actors if you actually to be transformative. So this is basically how I see that the partnership has moved and will be moving. So there will be place for not only the narrow tech fix innovation models, but there will increasingly we see that we are being joined by by living labs and movements that actually have greater ambitions towards transformation. So concluding, the scope, really, whether it's narrow or broad, plot level or more territorial, of living lab, there is a case for suggesting that this really matters in relation to transition and transformation. I think that when we are assigning central innovation roles to farmers and communities, and here I'm talking from the research perspective, we need to keep in mind that the joint transformative frameworks of agroecology and participatory research, we have to recall that. We can't see them as separate. If this is to cause some sort of change, we have to adopt that kind of understanding on it all. So, yeah, this was my suggestion. There's a lot of literature. I don't know if you're going to. We went through a lot of literature. This is actually also the results of some of our sort of mapping of the landscape and the understandings and coming together towards some sort of joint frameworks for how we can actually work on this in the partnership. We do a lot of this kind of thing in this particular work package where I'm involved. That's it. Thank you. Yeah.